Well, let's talk about friendships for a minute. Here's how you know if someone's your friend. A, you can tell them bad news, and they'll listen. They won't tell you why, you're stupid and why that bad thing happened to you and how something worse happened to them once and, derail the whole conversation. You can actually tell them bad news and they'll listen. So that's a good thing. And then this is a weirder thing. You can tell them good news and they'll help you celebrate. And that's a really good way of deciding who you should have around you. Because if you have someone around you, something good happens to you and you're kind of afraid to even admit it because, God, something good happened to you. It's like, you let that be known and it'll certainly be taken away. So, you come out and you sort of tell someone half-heartedly that something good happened to you and they give you a whack and then talk about, the great thing that happened to them 3 years ago. Or worse, the great thing that happened to someone that they knew 3 years ago. It's like, go away from that person. They're not helpful to you. And they're not helpful to themselves either. And so you want to surround yourself, you got to think about this. You got to surround yourself with people who want the best for the best part of you. You can hang around with weasels and losers that are trying to pull you down to justify the fact that they're spiraling downhill as well. And the upside of that is you don't have to have any responsibility and you can all whine about how wretched life is, so that's pretty attractive. But I would say it's also a bad medium to long-term plan. And so it's acceptable and desirable to try to surround yourself with people who are facilitating your development. And you might say, well, I've got people around, I know them well, they're not doing that well and they don't fit into that category. It's like, what's your point? What are you going to do with them exactly? If they'll listen and cooperate with you and move towards a better future, great. If they don't pay any attention and they keep doing the same damn things over and over and they're not going anywhere and it's painful, then maybe the proper thing to do is say, you just have your misery. I'll go off and have my life. And maybe you'll wake up at some point in the future and think that's a better way of being. Because just putting up with it is, well, they call that enabling, right? You put up with that sort of behavior, you're providing tacit consent for it and even tacit approval. It's like, it's a bad idea. You have, I would say, both the right and the responsibility to surround yourself with people who are good for the best part of you. There's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing, too, is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe. And that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live. You have a real life. And it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you think, well, There's 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly, but 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion, and so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient. 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stop really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. Two major problems that people face, obviously, are suffering, tragedy, and malevolence. And so that's the other thing that you're responsible for, is that you're supposed to look at the capacity for human evil as clearly as you possibly can, which is a very terrifying thing. You know, that causes post-traumatic stress disorder in people that aren't accustomed to it. And in the mythology that's associated with the encounter with evil, it's almost always the case that the entity that does the encountering, even if it does it voluntarily, is hurt by it. The idea would be that if you can face the malevolence and you can face the suffering, then that opens the door to your maximal potential. And then the optimistic part of that is, and this is why it's so useful to peer into the darkness, let's say, the optimistic part of that is that although the suffering is great and the malevolence is deep, your capacity to transcend it is stronger. If you set out a path towards a goal, which you want to do because you need a goal and you need a path, because that provides you with positive emotion, right? So you set up something as valuable, so that implies a hierarchy. You set up something as valuable. You decide that you're going to do that instead of other things, so that's kind of a sacrifice, because you're sacrificing everything else to pursue that. And then you experience a fair bit of positive emotion and meaning as you watch yourself move towards the goal. And so the implication of that is that the better the goal, the more full and rich your experience is going to be when you pursue it. So that's one of the reasons of
That's one of the reasons for developing a vision and for fleshing yourself out philosophically, because you want to aim at the highest goal that you can manage. Okay, so you do that. And then what you'll find is that as you move towards the goal, there are certain things that you have to accomplish that frighten you. You know, maybe you have to learn to be a better speaker, a better writer, a better thinker, or you have to be better to people around you, or you have to learn some new skills and you're afraid of that. Whatever, because it's going to stretch you if you pursue a goal, and so that'll put you up against challenges. Okay, so all the clinical data indicates, well, the opposite of safe spaces, as Jonathan Haidt has been pointing out, that what you want to do when you identify something that someone is avoiding, that they need to do because they're afraid, you have them voluntarily confront it. And so you break it down. What you try to do, if you're a behavior therapist, is you break down the thing they're avoiding into smaller and smaller pieces until you find a piece that's small enough so they'll do it. And it doesn't really matter as long as they start it. You know, then they can put the next piece on and the next piece. And what happens is they don't get less afraid exactly. They get braver. It's like there's more of them. And here's why. So imagine you do something new and that's informative. Right? There's information in the action, and then you can incorporate that information and turn it into a skill and turn it into a transformation of your perceptions. So there's more to you because you've tried something new. So that's one thing. But the second thing is, and there's good biological evidence for this now, that if you put yourself in a new situation, then new genes code for new proteins and build new neural structures and new nervous system structures. Same thing happens to some degree when you work out, right? Because your muscles are responding to the load, but your nervous system does that too. So you imagine that there's a lot of potential you locked in your genetic code. And then if you put yourself in a new situation, then the stress, that's the situational stress that's produced by that particular situation, unlocks those genes and then builds new parts of you. And so that's very cool, because who knows how much there is locked inside of you. Okay, so now here's the idea. So let's assume that scales as you take on heavier and heavier loads. That more and more of you get more and more informed because you're doing more and more difficult things, but more and more of you gets unlocked. And so then what that would imply is that if you got to the point where you could look at the darkest things, so that would be the abyss, right? That would be the deepest abyss. If you could look at the harshest things, like the most brutal parts of the suffering of the world and the malevolence of people and society, if you could look at that straight and directly, that would turn you on maximally. And so that's the idea of rescuing your father, because imagine that you're like the potential composite of all the ancestral wisdom that's locked inside of you biologically. But that's not going to come out at all unless you stress yourself, unless you challenge yourself. And the bigger the challenge you take on, the more that's going to turn on. And so that as you take on a broader and broader range of challenges and you push yourself harder, then more and more of what you could be turns on. And that's equivalent to transforming yourself into the ancestral father. Because you're like what would you call it? You're the consequence of all these living beings that have come before you. And that's all part of your biological potentiality. And then if you can push yourself, then all of that clicks on and that turns you into who you could be.
So I wondered what's motivated you, because you push in so many directions simultaneously. You have to be really highly motivated to do that. And so you figured out that the question, in a sense, was the answer.
Yeah, the question, or said another way, that seeking greater enlightenment and a better understanding of the universe and what questions to ask about it is something that we can continue to do as a civilization for...
likely forever.
Exactly. So
depending on how powerful Grok turns out to be.
Yeah, so then I thought, okay, I'll work on things that improve our understanding of the universe. I know now they have to say, like, at a base level, this is why I actually think we want a population increase, because population increase means that there are more people, that we've expanded the scale.
More brains, man.
Yeah, we've expanded the scale of consciousness to the degree that there are different cultures. We've expanded the scope of consciousness.
How did you cotton on to the fact that antagonistic attitude towards birth that's embedded in our culture now was something that should be called out and that was pathological?
I should perhaps go back to what is the foundation of my philosophy? Because that I think helps build up to explain my actions. So when I was, I don't know, about 11 or 12 years old, I had somewhat of an existential crisis because there just didn't seem to be any meaning in the world. Like I had no meaning to life. And I actually tried to read all the religious texts.
At that age?
Yes.
Okay.
I was a voracious reader as a kid. I obviously read the Bible. I read the Quran, the Torah, the various, but on the Hindu side, just trying to understand all these things. And obviously as a 12-year-old, you're not really going to understand these things super well.
You understood it well enough to have an existential crisis when you were 11 or 12.
Yeah, I'm just trying
That's a start.
Does anyone have an answer that makes sense? And then I started getting into the philosophy books, and I read quite a bit of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and which is quite depressing to read as a kid.
Yeah, I'd say that.
That's depressing as an adult, but none of them really seem to have, to me, answers that resonated, at least to me. But then I read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is really a book on philosophy disguised as humor. And what the point that Adams tries to make there is that we don't actually know all the answers, obviously. In fact, we don't even know what the right questions are. That's where he has this if you've read the book, the Earth is actually a giant computer to understand the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
And comes up with the answer 42.
Yeah.
And people are like, what does that mean? It says, you didn't understand the thing that's going to take a computer far more powerful than Earth is to understand what question to ask. That's simply the wrong question.
So was that the key realization, that the question was the thing?
That was a fundamental turning point, yeah.
Yeah, because that's it. So that's very interesting, because one of the things that you see constantly portrayed in hero myths across the world is that the adventure is the thing and that the search is the thing, rather than there being a final answer, as absurd as 42 might be, right? The conclusive answer is something like deep engagement in the process. So I'll give you an example of that. So in the Sermon on the Mount's a very detailed set of instructions.
Yeah.
So there's 3 parts to it. The first is aim at the highest thing that you can possibly conceive of and keep modifying that so your aim gets better. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is make the presumption that other people have the same intrinsic value as you do.
You have to be careful about that one.
Okay, let's discuss that. What would you say? It's a recognition of the universalist value of everyone who's made in the image of God. It's something like that. But the third thing is, once you do those 2 things, you can concentrate on the moment. See, and that seems to be, even technically, you can think about this neuropsychologically. If you're looking for meaning is a form of incentive reward. And incentive reward is dopaminergically mediated. And incentive reward occurs in relationship to advancement towards a goal, which is a form of entropy minimization, as it turns out, according to Carl Friston, who knows the thing.
Entropy is the ultimate boss battle.
Yeah. Negative emotion signifies the emergence of entropy, and positive emotion on the dopaminergic side signals its reduction. There's something that's more complex there, because the higher the goal that you're trying to attain, the more intrinsic value each step towards it comprises, and that's neuropsychologically accurate. It's part of the wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount is that if you posit the highest imaginable goal, then any step towards it that captures your attention is also deeply meaningful. And so that's an answer to what the meaning is of process, rather than say something like 42. And you said, it seems to me that you were intimating that your discovery through Adams, that the question was the thing, was key to the resolution of your existential crisis.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's part of the reason that you're motivated to say build Grok 3 and look deep.
To understand the universe.
Okay, so how old were you when you figured out that the question...
13 or something.
What did that do to you? What did that do to you?
I was a lot happier after that, because now it's okay. I'm just going to accept that we are ignorant of a great many things. Yeah. And we wish to be less ignorant, and anything we can do that will improve our understanding of the universe and make us less ignorant and have a deeper understanding of the universe, and even more questions to ask about the answer that is the universe, which is, I think, Adams' central point, is good. And is this a religion? I don't know. Maybe it is. But I think it's a good one. I'd call it the religion of curiosity.
Yeah. The ancient god of the Mesopotamians, his name was Marduk, and he was the best defense against ensuing chaos and state corruption. Okay, so that's how he was conceptualized. Okay, Marduk had eyes all the way around his head. Okay. Because he paid attention. Right, and he spoke magic words. Okay. Right, and he was literally, for the message, he was the agent that revitalized the tyrannical state and overcame evil, and also the force that dispensed with chaos and built something magnificent and cosmic out of it. Yeah.
Sounds like a force for good.
Yeah, well, the Mesopotamian emperor, so his job was to embody that spirit on earth. And they used to take him out of the city on New Year's Eve, strip him of his kingly clothing, humiliate him. They slapped him, the priests, and then they'd ask him to confess all the ways that he hadn't been a good Marduk, attentive and speaking properly in the previous year. And that's how they renewed the cosmos every year. And that's our New Year's celebration is a derivation of that, out with the old and in with the new. And the Egyptians, they worship the eye, right? You've seen that famous...
The all-seeing eye of Horus?
The all-seeing eye of Horus. That's the antidote to the eye of Sauron, by the way. Because if you don't use that vision, if each citizen doesn't use that vision, it's replaced by the totalitarian all-seeing eye. That's a hell of a thing to know. You talked about delving deeper into the structure of the universe, let's say, to answer fundamental questions like, and you are a remarkably forward-looking person. What the hell do you think you're building with these AI systems? What is this?
I think really what all the AI companies are aiming to build is digital superintelligence. So intelligence that's far smarter than any human.
Yeah.
And ultimately an intelligence that is far smarter than all humans combined. Now one can say, is this a wise thing to do? Isn't this dangerous? Unfortunately, whether we think that or not, it is being done. But really, from my standpoint, from the XAI team standpoint, we have the choice of being a spectator or a participant.
That's life, man.
Yeah, be a spectator or a participant. And I think if we're a participant, we've got a better chance, hopefully, of steering AI in a direction that is beneficial to humanity.
So why do you trust yourself on that front? That's an important question, right?
I don't trust myself entirely.
Good, yes. Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
An ethical conundrum, right?
Yes, there's an ethical conundrum.
Because you said this is happening. Now, the excuse that something is happening is not a rationale for participating in it, but then your next take is we have the chance to do this properly, let's say, as
maybe
opposed
better.
to... Okay.
I think we just, from a moral standpoint, we really just need to think that maybe we've got a chance of it being better to some degree than what others are doing. And we'll strive to avoid some of the pitfalls or directions that the others are going in. Because the others, from what I've seen, do not strive for truth.
What do they strive for?
They strive to give an answer, but they are, I think, trained to be politically correct. And the woke mind virus is woven in throughout them.
Yeah?
I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely. My students used to ask me because I've been teaching what I've been teaching for about 40 years. And one of the questions they used to ask me is how I knew that what I was teaching wasn't just another ideology. Because the postmodern take is all it is a plethora of power games. And so there's no rank ordering approaches to the truth in terms of their ethical suitability. But that's not the game that you're playing. And
obviously would not agree with that philosophy.
Why not?
The sort of moral relativism.
What's convinced you that's not a useful way of approaching things?
I think you can look at a given belief system and critique it as being likely to enhance or decrease enlightenment. Will any given belief system improve our understanding of the universe? Will we learn more things? Will we achieve a deeper understanding of physics? And
so that's grounded, at least in part, in a scientific framework, from the sounds of it.
Well, I think there are facts about the world.
Yes, right.
There are things that are, let's say, extremely likely to be true versus less likely to be true. I think if one thinks in terms of probabilities about any given sort of axiomatic statement, then that's the right way to think about it. And some things are 99.99% to be true. You can run experiments, you can confirm them, and others perhaps have a low probability of truth, 1% likely to be true, or just using extremes here. But any given statement should be thought of as having a probability of being true or untrue, a probability of being relevant to an argument or not relevant to an argument. We're just talking about the basics of cogency here.
Yeah. I didn't study science precisely. I wasn't as interested in the transformations of the material world. So I'm probably more people-oriented than thing-oriented temperamentally. So I started to study evil. Right?
Okay.
So that was my delving into the depths because I wanted to crack that. I wanted to understand not so much even whether it existed, because I became convinced of that very quickly, but what exactly that had to do with me. Because when I was reading history, I read it as a perpetrator and not as a victim or a hero.
I try to read history to discern the facts of what humans did, That
also has shaped the way that you act, though.
Probably, sure. I've read a lot of history, and I've tried to understand the rise and fall of civilizations. And
What do you think makes them fall?
one of the things is a decreasing birth rate, which seems to be a natural consequence of prosperity.
Yeah, isn't that strange, eh? Because you'd predict the opposite, wouldn't you?
As far as I know, every civilization that has experienced prosperity has had a decline in population. There may be a few exceptions. Perhaps people can enlighten me. I'll look at the comments on this interview to see perhaps what I can learn. But it seems that from what I've read, almost every civilization, when they become prosperous, their birth rate drops.
I think that's a consequence of the emergence of something like a non-punished hedonistic egocentrism.
Obviously, you mean there's certainly many examples of civilizations that become prosperous. There is generally a trend towards hedonism.
Yeah, you can get away with it if you're wealthy, eh? Because the consequences of your foolishness don't smack you on the head instantly.
Precisely. If you're a civilization under threat, let's say if you take, say, Rome, when they were trying to not get annihilated by Carthage, and they had Hannibal running around marauding Italy, they didn't have time for hedonism. Hedonism is not an option. We're going to get destroyed by Hannibal.
The chips are down.
When a civilization's under stress, there's very little hedonism that takes place.
William James said that the modern world needed a moral equivalent to war. He investigated the religious realm very deeply, and I think this was in the varieties of religious experience, and that really had an effect on me, because I think that you need something akin to an existential threat in order to set you straight.
I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
But if it's let's say if it's a spoiled child that kid gets everything he or she wants, and you have a Baruch assault, and then writ large, that is a civilization that is where people get everything they want.
I think it's the right way to think about it developmentally and neuropsychologically. Okay, you had a rough childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, like rough and tumble, rough childhood. Plenty of fights, and a father who was a difficult creature to contend with. Okay, what did that do for you? And are you grateful for it, or are you unhappy about it?
I guess you never know the things that really made you who you are today. At the end of the day, am I on net grateful for my life? I am. And perhaps even for the hard things, because those hard things, I learned from them.
What did you learn? I read your biography.
It's not an autobiography.
No, it's not. No, definitely not.
I would tell it in a different way than Isaacson, because Isaacson, who I think is an excellent biographer, is nonetheless looking at things through his lens and wasn't there at the time.
Of course, of course. One of the things that stood out for me too, though, from that, and I would like your comments about this, was the rough details of your childhood. A lot of physical altercations, and a lot of, I don't know exactly how to care.
Altercations. I mean, I was almost beaten to death within an inch of my life at one point.
That counts. Yeah. That definitely counts as a physical
just a few blows here and there. Yeah.
So what did that, okay. Why aren't you bitter about that? Because that's a pathway that people take.
I think that there are, one can take, and often people do take, the path of vengeance.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
That's what antinatalism is.
Yeah, to feel that the world has treated them unfairly, and that they will visit upon the world which the world has visited upon them.
And justify it by recourse to the reality of their own suffering,
exactly.
Which is often intense.
Yeah,
so the story of Job, one of the things I concluded from the story of Job, because it's a precursor to the crucifixion story. So Job makes two decisions. The first decision is that no matter how terrible things become for him, he will not lose faith in himself. And the second is, no matter what horrors are visited on him by Satan himself, he will not lose faith in the spirit that gave rise to the cosmic order. No matter what.
While I'm not a particularly religious person, I do believe that the teachings of Jesus are good and wise, and that there's tremendous wisdom in turn the other cheek. And for a while there, when I was saying, I thought that's really a weak thing to do.
Yeah, it can be.
If someone, and with respect to bullies at school, I think you shouldn't turn the other cheek. You should punch them on the nose, and then thereafter make peace with them. But they need to stop bullying you, and a punch in the nose will stop that, and then thereafter make peace. So
sometimes that punch on the nose is the first step in making peace with bullies.
Yes, it may change their career from being a bully to perhaps they shouldn't be doing such things. But yeah, I think there's, anyway, I think this notion of forgiveness is important. I think it's essential, because if you don't forgive, then, as I forget who said it, but an eye for an eye makes everyone blind. If you're going to seek vengeance, and you have this never-ending cycle of vengeance.
There are anthropological speculations that we were caught in a 350,000-year cycle of not getting anywhere after modern human beings emerged, precisely because of that. because we couldn't get out of accelerating tit-for-tat revenge cycles, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually a big believer in the principles of Christianity. I think they're very good.
So in what sense, then, are you not religious? Part of your goal, if you want to take your place in the hierarchy properly, is to be a good person. And that was the argument I was trying to make in the chapter. Not that you're supposed to be like the most brutal crustacean on the block. You know, it's so foolish. It was Kathy Newman, I think, that asked me in the UK. So you're saying that human society should be organized along the lines of lobsters. It's like, look, lady, if you're gonna insult someone, you might want to try accusing them of something, of believing something that someone somewhere believed at least once in the entire history of the human race. And not that. Yes, absolutely. Lobsters for everyone. You know, that's how, what I was trying to make the case was that we have this very old system in our nervous systems, which is very old, which keeps track of where we are in hierarchies, and that regulates our emotions because of it, because it's really important to you and you and you and you, if you're not completely bloody psychopathic, that you have a place in a social hierarchy and that you're admired and respected and valued by other people. And it's so important that the neurochemical system that keeps track of that regulates your other emotions, so that if you're low on the totem pole because, well, for whatever the reason happens to be, sometimes you deserve it, sometimes it's accidental, sometimes you've been hurt, there's lots of ways that this can happen, your serotonin levels plummet like a defeated lobster, and then you feel way more negative emotion about everything and way less positive emotion about everything. And that's absolutely dreadful. Like that's clinical depression, and it's a terrible, terrible condition. And so it's absolutely crucial that you maintain a tenable position in a hierarchy, and not one of power, but one of competence. And at least even if you're not in a position that's tenable, you're moving upward towards one that's tenable, because that at least gives you hope. You know, because maybe you're young and useless and you don't know what the hell you're doing. You're just getting started. And so you're a low man on the totem pole, but it's not like you're stuck there forever. You do some decent work. I had some kid tell me the other day, it was really nice. God, you know, I was in a rough shape 2 years ago. I was just getting married. I just got married, and I was nihilistic as hell and depressed and bitter, and things weren't going well for me at all. And I was unemployed, and one of my friends got me a job. And he said, I didn't really like the bloody job. I didn't want to have the job, and I was kind of dragging my ass to the work and not doing it well. And I listened to one of your lectures, and it said, look, if you haven't got anything going for you, but you have a job, don't quit your job. Whether you hate it or not, it's like, man, that's what you're hanging on to the edge of the world with your fingertips, you know? Don't let go. Oh, if you can find a better job, okay, fine. But you don't just quit, because then what? You're done. Another thing that I mentioned was, why don't you just try to work as hard as you can at your damn job for like 6 weeks, right? All flat out. You know, if you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. That's something worth thinking about. You know, you've got a job, maybe you show up 15 minutes early and you leave 15 minutes late. You know, and you actually work, and your boss notices, because he would probably notice, and then maybe someone's going to get promoted, and maybe it'll be you, because something's going to tilt the scales, and that little extra bit of work done without cynicism and resentment might be enough. Well, he said he started at $21 an hour, and in 6 weeks he was making $37 an hour. And it's not a king's ransom, man, but it's a hell of a lot more than zero, and it's quite a lot more than 21. He said his life had turned around substantially because he learned if he put some damn effort into it. And I'm not trying to be Joe Optimist here. Like, I know that people hit runs of bad luck, and that things can take you out of life, right? Unfortunate illnesses and betrayal, and like there's no shortage of randomness and horror that can wipe you out even if you're doing your best. But you don't have a better bloody plan than to do your best, and it tends to work a lot better than you think. And what's so interesting about the hierarchies that people set up is that
That's how they're set up. They're not set up on power. They're set up on reciprocity and skill and trust. Not always. And if you're in a job where you work hard and you're a good guy and you're doing your best and your boss is a bloody tyrant and you never get a break, it's like, okay, fine. You're in a Foucault world. Get the hell out of it. You get your resume set up, write your CV, fill in the educational gaps that you have, send out your 25 resumes a day, and prepare to make a lateral move because you're in a bad place. But almost everywhere, and this has certainly been the case virtually everywhere I've worked, and I've had like 50 jobs, if you go above and beyond the call of duty in an awake and intelligent way, interpersonally, socially, with regards to the diligence of your work, with regards to the truth of your attitude and your courage and all of that, that will work. And if you try it for a year and it doesn't work, then go somewhere else, because you can, right? You're free. I mean, it's not easy. You can't just walk out the door and instantly find another job, but you're not enslaved. You could make a move. You could even decide that you're going to make a move and double your salary. It's not a bad goal, and it's certainly a possibility. It's like, it isn't hierarchy. It's ethics that determines success in a functional society. It's ethics that determines success, not power. The rest of it's a bloody lie. And that doesn't mean that all our systems are perfectly ethical. You got to be awake. If you're in a system, there's going to be some corruption in it. Part of what you're supposed to do is keep your damn eyes open for the corruption and your mouth speaking truth, so when the corruption starts to take root, you object to it so the whole damn system doesn't turn into a pathological power play. And that's part of your ethical responsibility as a conscious being, an ethical being, a religious being for that matter, and a citizen. And you're charged with that. That's why you vote. That's why you're the cornerstone of your state, man. You're the what would you call? You're the wellspring of the ethical actions that replenish the dying world. That's what you are. And if you act, that's what you are. And if you act that out properly, then things work. And that's why that's always been described as ethical behavior. It's not because you're supposed to be good, and being good isn't that easy anyways. And it certainly doesn't mean being nice and harmless. It's not an easy thing to be good. You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good. Because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground. And you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no. And you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. And that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you. Plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility, and you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it, and no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. It's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. The people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. And I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in sterquilinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up, stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror.
We're made in the image of God. So,
yes.
And we have Adam is granted the right and the responsibility to subdue and to name and to
yes.
put everything in its proper place,
yes.
right? And Eve to bring to Adam's attention the things that remain outside his purview. And
yeah.
those are real things.
Yeah.
So human beings have something real to do.
Yeah.
And so then you might say, real and important. And you might say, well, what makes something real? Now, this is a hard question. You know, and the materialist answer is, well, let's say sensory evidence. But I don't think that's right. I think what makes things real is death and limitation. Like if you're playing a game, if you're playing a video game, a first-person shooter game, it's a game because when you get killed, you're not dead.
Yeah.
It's not a game when death is in the in the offings. Yeah. And what we're doing as human beings is real.
Yeah.
And the price we pay for reality, it looks to me like the price we pay for reality is death.
Yeah.
And it's real. Yeah. And so that's going to have these consequences. And I think, you highlighted the most, at least arguably the most painful of those consequences. People think there's nothing worse than death. I think, well, you have a limited imagination, first of all, because there are many things worse than death. And one of the things that might well be worse than death is the death of a child.
Yes.
I think it's a very rare parent who wouldn't happily substitute themselves in a contest of death with their child, if in a heartbeat even. And so now why does God demand that price of reality? I think it has something to do with the fact that we do actually have something important to do. We're supposed to be establishing the kingdom of heaven of God on earth. And that's hard, like actually hard. And the eternal enemies of that are sin and death. Yes. And those are real. And fighting them is real. And when you're in a real battle, there's real death and there's real evil. And that's brutal, but that's the price of reality. Now, then the question is, well, under what conditions is that price worth paying? And I think that's what the biblical stories actually attempt to explicate. The offering to Abraham, it isn't a life of ease. It's not a life of comfort, and it's not a life of hedonistic gratification. Mm-hmm. It's something like a life of adventure. Yeah. And I would also say there's probably no adventure without death.
Yes.
If you think about the movies that people watch, people will go watch secret agent movies and superhero movies. Yeah. The secret agent movies in some ways work better because the person is mortal and the depth of their commitment is measured by their willingness to put their life on the line. Yeah. So I don't know, it looks to me like without this is a very weird thing, but it looks to me like without death, there's no reality.
Yeah.
And then you might say, well, that's a price not worth paying. It's like, that's an understandable argument, especially that's the sort of thing you ask yourself when a child dies. But then you think you said something also that bears on that. Well, you said the depth of your grief is proportionate to the magnitude of your love.
Yes.
And so you might say, well, how could God constitute a world made such that a child could die? And then you think, well, if you have a child and the child dies and you grieve, the grief is an indication of the magnitude of the loss. And so the fact that you grieve, that's a testament to the value of the life, even though it was truncated.
Yes.
So your grief is the proof of the value of the life.
Right.
And so what that means, as far as I can tell, is that grief itself is the justification of life in the face of death.
But then there's the afterlife. And I believe in the afterlife. And I believe in heaven. And I believe in it more than I've ever believed. I've always been a student of heaven as a Christian, and the Bible speaks so much of heaven. But when my son went to be there, I wanted to know more about it. And as you read the Bible, you realize that heaven is a real place for real people to do real things. You know, Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. And heaven in the Bible is pictured as a city. It's pictured as a country. It's pictured as a paradise. The Bible tells us we'll eat in heaven. We'll be reunited with loved ones in heaven. We'll be active. And then one day heaven comes to earth in what we call the millennium. Heaven and earth become one. So I believe very strongly in that. Now, can I prove it? Well,
what do you think that means? So let's delve in. That's such a hard topic. Let's delve into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So Christ tells his followers to be perfect like his Father in heaven is perfect.
Yes.
And there's continuous injunctions in the Gospels to bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Yeah.
That's central to the Lord's Prayer. And there's an idea that lurks in the opening chapters of Genesis about the reestablishment of the eternal Eden. And so it looks like there's an insistence that the goal of the true religious striver is to establish paradise on earth, something like that. And I mean, that can take some vicious utopian spins that are very counterproductive, but that's the underlying idea. Now, I don't know how to reconcile that with the idea of, so that's heaven. That's the heaven that people are striving to bring about when they aim upward properly and walk up Jacob's ladder. And I don't know how to reconcile that with notions of the afterlife with regard to death. We have the strange insistence on the part of Christianity, too, that Christ defeated death and evil.
Yeah.
In spite of the evidence that death and evil continue in this world unabated. And so there's a paradox there. Like, how do you reconcile in your own mind the insistence that part of the Christian moral pattern is to perfect the world and to raise the material up to the heavenly with the notion of the afterlife and immortality? I know that's a terrible question, but
no, it's
I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
Well, I think coming back to the statement of Jesus, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Bottom line, nobody can be perfect. We fall short. So the point of that to me is we sin against God. Now, some of us sin more than others, but we all sin. We had a little Halloween event at our church, and we had one of those, you know, the bell where you hit the thing with the hammer. And so I've hit that and hit the bell in the past. So I got it out and I hit it and I got so close, but I never got it. I think I spent a half hour trying to ring that bell and I fell short. So God has set perfection. That's the standard for humanity. Well, who can be perfect? Answer no one. That's where Jesus comes in, because the Bible says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So going back to the Garden of Eden, our first parents sinned. And because they ate of the forbidden fruit, which, by the way, the Bible never says was an apple. I don't know where the apple came from. But, you know, it was something that was very attractive. If you ate of it, it would give you this supernatural wisdom, knowing good and evil. Supposedly, that's what the lie was. They ate of the fruit and sin came into the world. So if Adam and Eve had not eaten of the forbidden fruit, we wouldn't die. Mm-hmm. If they had not eaten of the forbidden fruit, we wouldn't age and get sick. If they hadn't eaten of the forbidden fruit, I'd probably have hair right now, right? So these are the effects of aging. But here's the thing. is that the earth, life on earth is not everything. This is the before life. Then there's the afterlife. C.S. Lewis, what did he call it? He had a phrase for it that he used often in his writings about, Shadowlands. That's right. Shadowlands. So the idea of Lewis was that what we're seeing now at its very best, take the greatest moment of your life with your friends, having a meal, enjoying life together, maybe a beautiful sunset. It's a shadow of greater things to come. It's not like earth is the real thing and heaven is the imitation. It's actually, according to the Bible, the other way around. Heaven is the real thing. See, going back to Abraham, he was looking for a city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. He was looking for something he never found in all of his journeys. And I think it was a longing for the afterlife. And we all have that longing. And one day when we get to heaven, I think we'll see that the greatest experiences of earth were only a shadow of greater things to come. So I believe very firmly in a real heaven where I'll do real things and I'll be reunited with my son.
America's healthcare system is lacking in any real care. Insurance companies regularly deny progressive treatment options, primary care physicians refuse to order comprehensive lab work, and the standards of care lag years behind the leading research. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health represents a paradigm shift in how we approach medicine. The premier health optimization platform, Merrick Health empowers you to maximize your longevity and performance with the confidence that comes from having experts in your back pocket. They offer cutting-edge diagnostic labs, concierge health coaching, and expert clinical oversight. They help you achieve your health and fitness goals by leveraging data-driven lifestyle and nutrition recommendations, along with supplement and prescription treatment options. If you're listening to this show, then you're probably a proponent of taking your health into your own hands. That's why we've teamed up with Merrick Health to offer a turnkey optimization package designed for those who want to maximize their performance and longevity with the most elaborate testing on the market. You'll receive extensive lab work, thorough lab reports, video calls with Merrick's health experts, and expedited onboarding. Go to merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson to get the same panel and medical oversight I get and save 10% at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson at checkout.
Well, it's clear that when you have those great experiences, that they're, first of all, the fact that we can have a category that's great experiences indicates that there's some commonality between those experiences, right? The peak moments of your life when you're at the apex, right? It's all the same symbolic language. And that obviously is emblematic of something that unites all of those episodes, right? And you could call that heavenly, and you could think about it as an echo of a place. I mean, I still don't understand the relationship between that. And I think that's all true, by the way. And I mean, I've seen too that Jacob's ladder, like God is the ineffable pinnacle of this endless upward spiral that's Jacob's ladder. And he's ineffable in part because maybe you have an ideal and you take 10 steps toward it and now you're near it, but then you see that the true ideal is yet farther than that. And so you reconstruct your vision of the ideal and you progress towards that. And then when you get there, you see that that's only a shadow of the true ideal. And I don't think there's any bottom to the abyss, so to speak, on the malevolent side. I don't think there's any pinnacle to upward. And there is a vision of heaven in that. But I still struggle to understand the relationship between that and the moral requirement of people to aim towards. One of the things my wife and I have been practicing, we got much better at this. She just about died 3 years ago, and so did I, and close enough so that as far as we were both concerned, we were either dead or wanted to be. And for a very long time. And anyways, that didn't happen. And so we were pretty happy about the fact that each other were around before that, but much happier afterwards. And we've really never forgotten that, even moment to moment. And one of the things that we've decided to practice is to notice when we're interacting with one another in a manner that's optimal. And it's interesting because I've known her since she was 8. Wow. So we were childhood friends and we were good friends. And I can remember what she was like when she was a little kid, and she was an excellent little kid, and she was very popular and very much fun to be around. And I can see in her that spirit coming back to life, like very frequently. And so one of the things we've learned to do is to notice when that's happening, right? And first of all, to notice, second, to appreciate it, but then to see if we could practice extending the amount of time that we're in that state. Yeah. And you can get much better at that if you practice, just like you get better at everything that you practice. And that is something like I used to counsel my clients as well to do this, is if they were depressed, is, to monitor their mood. And then to see times when they were less depressed, because even someone who's even quite depressed still varies. So you say, well, sometimes you're going to be like on the brink of suicide, but other times you're going to forget that you're depressed. You got to see what you're doing when things are better. And then you have to start doing those things more. Right. So you can practice that. And so you can take these little visions of paradise that you get in life and you can expand them with practice. And then I think as you do that, inside that window, then another window opens up, or another door. That's the door you knock on, right? Another door opens, and then you can expand that. And I don't think that is a paradisal vision. I don't think there is any end to that. But I still don't understand the relationship that between that, even theologically, and the idea of life after death. I can see that it means life eternal, because what happens in those moments of transcendence is that you do get a sense of the value of life that's eternal, right? So you're living in eternity. But as I said, I still don't understand the relationship between that and post-death existence. And I haven't found anything biblically that's helped me clarify that. Still a mystery to me. It has something to do with heaven descending and the material world ascending and some vision of the ultimate unity of those things, but I can't make any more heads or tails of it than that. How did that become clearer to you, say, in the aftermath of your son's death?
Well, that's one of the biggest questions of all. What happens after we die?
I've got a question. One that I wanted to ask you last time, but we didn't have time to get to it. And one that really piggybacks off what you were just talking about, how there's different ways to explore the world, one of them being reading. And I think that's one very, very important and timeless way of exploring the world. What do you think about this phenomenon? Less people are reading. Like, it feels like almost nobody is reading per capita. What do you make of that? Do you see that as an existential crisis?
No.
What do you make of it?
No. Well, reading for pleasure has always been a minority occupation. Like, most people don't read for pleasure. Of the people who read for pleasure, only a small proportion buy books. Of the people who buy books, only a small proportion buy difficult books. It's a specialty market. And I don't think that's changing. What I do see happening, though, is that is being expanded in surprising ways by such things as YouTube videos and podcasts.
So you can find the value in something like that is just as valuable as something you could possibly find in a book.
Well, I think that the two technologies have their advantages and disadvantages. The thing about a book that you can't get from a discussion is that a book is like a portrait as opposed to a photograph. A photograph, it's click. That's that. A portrait you layer on and layer on and layer on and work over for weeks. You still have the same single image, but there's this depth to it. And a book enables you to think and then rethink and think and then rethink. And so you can go deeper in a book than you can, I would say, in any other medium. Okay. But that doesn't mean you can't go deep in a podcast. And it doesn't mean that there's no educational utility in podcasts. Plus, there's audiobooks, right? And people are listening to those.
Well, that was another question. Do you think that audiobooks are just as valuable as books?
Oh, sure.
Just as good. Well,
the thing is, if you can really read, you can read way faster than you can listen. So reading is more effective, except that, and this is what's cool about podcasts and what's game-changing about them, I would say, is we can't read while you're driving.
Yeah.
You can't read while you're doing the dishes or exercising. And so all of a sudden with the podcast world, people have all this time that was used maybe listening to music, which is fine, right? But lots of people now are listening to like difficult podcasts.
Yeah, educational ones.
Yes. And long, detailed discussions about political issues that was never possible with television or even with radio for that matter. So, and you know, people say, well, young people have a fragmented attention span. It's like, well, yeah, but Joe Rogan does 3-hour podcasts, and
Right.
those do just fine. And your
Right.
podcast is how long
They're
usually?
not long, 2 hours,
Yeah.
generally.
Yeah.
Right. So that's not for a fragmented attention.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
no, I
But
think it's good.
You're absolutely right. I think the number one person who listens to this podcast in general, are people who are occupied doing something else.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I think you're right. That's a really valuable to be able to utilize that space.
Definitely. It's found time.
Right.
And so that's why the podcast market, I think, has exploded. It's like, oh, look, I can make use of commuters. You know,
Right.
people spend thousands of dollars a month in their time commuting. It's like, poof, all of a sudden you can make that. You can take a university degree while you're commuting, essentially, you know, in terms of the knowledge that you can attain.
Sure.
So I'm not pessimistic about that at
Interesting.
all.
And
That's
also
nice to
the
hear.
way that you have been using YouTube with your content is kind of amazing.
It's yeah.
The way that there's hundreds of thousands of views on your lectures and
Yeah. And they're difficult.
I
mean,
They're
one of the-
difficult
and
lectures.
long.
Like they push me when I'm lecturing, and they're long. That's
Yeah.
right. And there's a big market for high quality educational material. So, or
I think-
demanding educational material, let's say.
One of the brilliant things you've done is you market yourself really well, and to the new media, I think, where your contemporaries weren't doing that,
right.
and so you really broke new ground with that. And I mean, it's paid dividends for you, obviously.
Yeah, well, it's part of my insane curiosity, you know. And I've always learned. It's this same thing we were talking about 10 minutes ago. It's like.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of different things in my life, and I've always felt like a complete idiot when I started doing them, because that's why Carl Jung said, for example, that the fool is the precursor to the savior. You have to be willing to be a fool to advance, because when you first move in your new direction, what the hell do you know? You're just a bumbling dimwit, you know, but you won't be that for long.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Whereas if you stay in your little safe place, your little safe space, let's say, then, something will get you sooner or later. You can pretty well be sure of that. But temporarily you're safe. Well, that's not helpful. So when I started, it started when I started talking to journalists. They would phone me and I would talk to them. And most of my colleagues they'd usually say something dismissive about journalists, like, well, they always get it wrong. It's like, well, first of all, there's no they. And what makes you think you're important enough to pay attention to anyways? And if they get it wrong, maybe it's because you didn't explain it very well. And the journalists would call and I'd talk to them. And well, then they'd offer me an opportunity. So I got an opportunity to go on a TV show. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll do that. And so I did that and it worked pretty well. And then I got an opportunity to do some more. And then I was on a regular on a TV panel news show in Ontario. And then I got this little 13-part series that they made out of my courses and started doing public lectures, and those all worked. And then I thought, oh, well, what the hell would happen if I put these on YouTube? There seems to be a market for them. But it was pretty amateurish.
You think that whole journey started by just taking the call from that first journalist?
Oh, sure. But taking it in a particular way. It was the same way that we're having this conversation. I thought, well, a journalist has a question. I'm not doing anything expedient. I'm not saying, well, I'm hoping that something will come of this. But I didn't have a specified goal in mind. I thought, let's have a conversation
And
let the chips fall where they will. Yeah. And one of the things that distinguishes me, I would say, from many of my colleagues, and perhaps from many people, is that generally when someone comes along and says, well, would you like to do this? I'd say, okay, let's give it a try. And I don't expect that I'm going to be particularly good at it how would I be? I'm certainly not as good at it as I'm going to be, that's for sure.
Right.
Because obviously when you first start something, you're just not that good at it. But, I felt like a fool when I first started to practice as a therapist, when I first started to lecture, when I first started to work as a business consultant, when I was designing software, when I was going on, starting to do media events. It's like, what the hell do I know? I don't know how to do this. It's like, whatever, man. It's like,
when you first
move ahead.
When you first uploaded to YouTube?
Yeah, well, I mean, the channel kind of limped along for a while. I mean, it depends on how you measure it. But, I mean, when I really sat up and paid attention was in April 2016, the views hit the 1 million mark. And I thought, million, eh? What does that mean? And I really thought about it. I thought, 1 million's a lot. If I sold 1 million books, it's like, that's when you do the little touchdown dance, right? At the end of the field. because that just doesn't happen. And I'd never write a scientific paper that had 1 million views. That just never happened, ever, not once, right? Then you think, well, if you talk to 50 stadiums full of 20,000 people, you'd think that's noticeable, right? That's noticeable. I thought, 1 million. And people were watching the lectures, like their long lectures, they were watching them. It wasn't just 30 seconds. They were in there. Like some people would browse and pop out, but lots of them were watching them right to the end. And so I thought, all right, what the hell is this YouTube thing? Anyways, what is this? It's not cute cat videos. It's, and then I thought, oh, I get it. I see what it is. It's like the invention of the printing press. It's that big. For the first time in human history, the spoken word has as large a reach and as long a duration as a book.
Right.
That's never happened, period.
It's a great analogy.
It's amazing. And then that just blew me away. I thought, oh, this is a Gutenberg revolution. This is a big deal.